What if the thing doing your thinking is not inside your skull? Not a metaphor, not a spiritual claim, a specific, testable scientific proposition with peer-reviewed research behind it, an institutional silence around it that is itself worth examining. What if consciousness is not something the brain generates, the way a furnace generates heat, but something the brain participates in, the way an antenna participates in a signal that was already there? For decades, this inquiry has remained documented in published scholarship, formal papers, named researchers, measurable predictions, and the mainstream response has been the same pattern every time. Careful acknowledgement, minimal follow-up, no funded research programs treating it as a serious priority. 7 years of silence here, 30 years of silence there. The question gets a name and a citation, and then nothing happens. Here is the thing about the materialist model of consciousness that nobody says plainly. It has not been proven. It is assumed. The working framework in mainstream neuroscience is that the brain produces consciousness the way the liver produces bile. Complexity reaches a threshold, experience switches on, and the question of why that happens is treated as a question for later, or not a real question at all. That framework is not a conclusion drawn from solved problems. It is a starting position that the field built its methods around, and the problem it leaves open is not a small one. The hard problem of consciousness is not a philosophical technicality. It is a specific gap. Why does any physical process produce subjective experience at all? Not how the brain processes information. Not which regions activate under which conditions. Why does any of it feel like something? That question has no answer inside the classical model. It has a label: emergence, complexity, integrated function. These are descriptions of the gap, not solutions to it. And the quantum consciousness frameworks exist specifically because serious researchers looked at that gap and concluded that the tools classical neuroscience is using are not capable of closing it. Here is my position on what follows from that. When a framework cannot answer the central question it was built to answer, and a competing framework makes specific testable predictions that experiments have returned results consistent with, the appropriate response is engagement, not dismissal, not silence. The appropriate response is the same process that moves every other field forward. You test it, you try to break it, you publish what you find. That process has not happened here at any scale matching the importance of the question. And the importance of the question is not small. Because if consciousness is not produced by the brain, but is instead a fundamental property of reality, the implications do not stay inside neuroscience. They reach into physics, into the interpretation of quantum mechanics, into the basic picture of what the universe is and what is doing the observing. We have spent serious institutional resources asking whether microbial life exists on Mars, sterile, cold, atmosphereless rock, 200 million miles away. Simultaneously, a formally published scientific framework arguing that the signature of something more fundamental than neurons might be detectable inside our own biology has sat in the literature with no funded program designed to test it. What does that asymmetry tell you about which discoveries we are actually prepared to make? The quantum consciousness models are not New Age speculation dressed in scientific language. They are not the kind of thing you find in wellness podcasts. Roger Penrose is one of the most decorated mathematical physicists alive. Stuart Hameroff is an anesthesiologist who identified a specific molecular mechanism with a specific testable prediction. The prediction has been tested. The results went in the direction the model predicted. And the response from mainstream neuroscience has been, with some exceptions, to note this carefully and continue as before. What the actual science says, when you read it, without deciding in advance what it is allowed to conclude, is more disturbing than anything the speculation industry has produced on this subject. The speculation industry gives you a comfortable version where consciousness is mysterious and beautiful and may be connected to everything. The peer-reviewed data gives you something harder. It gives you a measurement problem that the most successful theory in the history of physics has never resolved. It gives you experimental results pointing at quantum processes in biological tissue that the brain is too warm objection was supposed to rule out. It gives you a gap in the mainstream model that 30 years of research has not closed. That is what this is about. Not mysticism, not metaphor, the peer-reviewed data and what it implies when you read it, without deciding in advance what it is allowed to mean. There are two versions of the consciousness problem, and the scientific mainstream has spent decades solving the easier one while treating the hard one as if it does not exist. The easy problems are genuinely hard. Do not misread that. Figuring out how the brain processes visual information, how it stores memories, how it integrates signals from thousands of neurons and produces coordinated behavior that work is technically demanding and scientifically legitimate. Researchers have mapped neural pathways, identified firing patterns, built computational models that replicate aspects of perception and decision-making with real precision. That is serious science. But here is what all of it explains: the mechanism, the information processing, the input-output relationship between stimulus and response. What it does not explain, what it has never touched, is why any of that processing feels like anything at all. That is the hard problem. David Chalmers named it formally in 1995. The question is not how the brain processes the wavelength of light that corresponds to red. The question is why that processing produces an experience. Why does red look like something? Why is there a quality to it, that specific saturated warmth, rather than just a signal traveling through a system that responds to it? A camera processes the same wavelength. A spectrometer measures it more precisely than your eye does. Neither of them sees red. Neither of them has any experience of anything. Your brain does something those systems do not do. And 30 years after Chalmers put the problem into formal language, neuroscience cannot tell you what that something is. Take pain. This is a cleaner example. When you touch something hot, your nervous system detects tissue damage, sends a signal, triggers a withdrawal reflex, generates a behavioral response. You can map every step of that chain. You can identify the nociceptors, trace the signal through the spinal cord, watch the brain regions activate on an fMRI scan. The mechanism is documented. Here is the question. The mechanism does not answer. Why does it hurt? Why is there suffering attached to that signal, rather than just a reflexive movement? A thermostat responds to heat and triggers a response. It does not suffer. Your hand does. Something is happening in you that is not happening in the thermostat, and the gap between those two things is the hard problem. Here is the thing about this that should bother you. The mainstream response to Chalmers was not to solve the problem. It was to dispute whether the problem was real. A significant portion of the neuroscience and philosophy of mind community spent years arguing that the hard problem is an illusion, that once you fully explain the mechanisms, the question dissolves, that once you know everything about how the brain processes information, there is nothing left to explain. Daniel Dennett made this argument most forcefully. Consciousness is what complex information processing looks like from the inside. The experience just is the mechanism, fully described. That position has a name in the literature. It is called eliminativism, or sometimes illusionism. And here is my position on it. If your explanation of subjective experience requires you to argue that subjective experience does not actually exist in the way it appears to exist, you have not solved the problem. You have defined it away. The redness of red did not become less real because you drew a diagram of a visual cortex. The pain in your hand did not stop hurting because a researcher mapped the nociceptive pathway. The experience is the data point. An explanation that requires you to dismiss the data point is not an explanation. Now look at what the quantum consciousness theories are actually doing. Penrose and Hameroff, integrated information theory, the frameworks that have been quietly accumulating evidence for decades. They are not trying to explain behavior. They are not trying to map neural correlates of consciousness. They are specifically attempting to address the hard problem. Why is there experience at all? Their answer involves physics at a level below classical neuroscience. Whether that answer is correct is a separate question. The point is that they are the only serious scientific frameworks that are even trying to answer the right question. The mainstream has been solving the easy problems and calling that progress on the hard one. It is not. Here is the dark part. The dominant explanation, the one that appears in textbooks, the one that gets cited in popular science coverage, is that consciousness emerges from complexity. When neural systems become sufficiently complex, consciousness appears. That is the claim. Now ask yourself, what does that actually say? It says that at some threshold of complexity, something qualitatively new happens. It does not say what that threshold is. It does not say what happens.
Open your
at
mind
that
to a journey
threshold.
of a lifetime, a journey
It does
that
not
happens within a
identify
fraction
the
of a second.
mechanism by which
Welcome to the
non-conscious matter
electrifying world of
organized in a
brain
complex
neurons
pattern
where
becomes
impulses are
matter that
unleashed.
has experiences.
Imagine, if you will, a bustling
It
city at peak
names
hour.
the transition.
Now replace that city with your brain and the
does not
vehicles with
explain it.
neurons. Each neuron,
Emergence is
a
not a
marvel of
mechanism.
nature, carrying
It is a
important messages at
placeholder
lightning
that sounds like a
speed.
mechanism.
There's no room for error in
It
this
gives you a
high-stakes
word
relay race.
to
A
put in
single
the
misstep
sentence where the
could result in a
explanation should go.
miscommunication, potentially
Calling
leading to
something
dire
emergent
consequences.
is not an
But fear
explanation
not,
of how it
these
works.
diligent little messengers
It is a
hardly
way
ever
of giving the
falter.
mystery a name
The journey of a
and then
brain
filing
impulse
it
is not
under
just
solve.
speedy, it's
In
intricate.
1989,
Neurons
a
don't
mathematician
just
and
pass the
physicist at
message along,
Oxford
they
named
transform
Roger
it, modulate it,
Penrose
and even
published a book
amplify it.
arguing that
From the
human
moment you
consciousness
decide to lift your
could not
finger to the
even in
actual
principle
act,
be produced
countless
by a
neurons
classical
spring into
computer.
action, working together
Not
in
that
perfect
computers are not
harmony.
powerful enough yet.
So next
Not that
time
we
you
haven't
blink
built
or
the right
breathe, remember
architecture.
there's a whole
In
world of
principle,
activity happening right
that is a
inside
much
your head.
stronger claim, and it
Unseen,
rests on something
unheard,
specific.
but
Here is the
undeniably
argument.
present. This is the
In
electrifying
1931,
journey of brain
Kurt
neurons,
Gödel
where every
proved that
second
any
impulses
formal
are
mathematical
unleashed.
system powerful enough to describe arithmetic contains true statements that cannot be proved within that system. The system is either incomplete or inconsistent. No classical algorithm escapes this. A formal computational system running on rules cannot step outside its own rule set to recognize truths that lie beyond it. Penrose looked at that result and saw something important. Human mathematicians can recognize certain Gödelian truths. We can see from outside a formal system that a statement is true, even though no procedure inside the system can prove it. If that is accurate, and Penrose argued it is, then human cognition is doing something no classical computation can do. Something is happening in the brain, and that is not rule-following in the algorithmic sense. The question Penrose spent the next several years trying to answer was what, physically, that something could be. His answer involved quantum mechanics, specifically a process he called objective reduction. Standard quantum mechanics tells you that a quantum system in superposition collapses into a definite state when measured. What triggers that collapse is one of the genuinely unresolved problems in physics. Penrose proposed that collapse is not triggered by external measurement. It happens when the quantum superposition reaches a threshold of space-time curvature, a gravitational instability at the Planck scale. At that point, the superposition self-collapses, objectively, without an observer forcing it. And that collapse event, he argued, is not a computation. It is a non-computable physical process. That is where consciousness enters the picture. If cognition involves these collapse events rather than classical information processing, then cognition is doing something that no algorithm can replicate, which is exactly what the Gödel argument requires. Now here is the question Penrose could not answer on his own. Where in the brain does this happen? What is the physical substrate where quantum superpositions could form, persist long enough to reach the collapse threshold and produce something that feeds into neural activity? That is where Stuart Hameroff enters. Hameroff is an anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona. His research, long before he encountered Penrose's work, focused on microtubules. These are protein structures inside every cell in the body, including neurons. They form the internal scaffolding of the cell, manage cell division, and in neurons, they help regulate synaptic activity. Hameroff had been looking at microtubules for a different reason, but what he found was relevant. The tubulin proteins that make up microtubules have specific quantum properties. They can exist in different conformational states. They are arranged in lattice patterns that could theoretically support quantum information processing, and they are shielded from the thermal noise of the surrounding cellular environment in ways that might allow quantum coherence to persist longer than you would expect. Hameroff read Penrose's book. He contacted him. The collaboration produced Orchestrated Objective Reduction, Orch-OR. The core claim is that microtubules inside neurons sustain quantum superpositions of tubulin states. Those superpositions are orchestrated by biological processes, hence the name. When they reach the objective reduction threshold Penrose described, they collapse. That collapse is a moment of proto-conscious experience. Billions of these events occurring in synchronized microtubule networks across the brain produce what we call consciousness. That is the theory. Here is the response it got. The mainstream objection was immediate, and at the time, it seemed decisive. The brain is warm. The brain is wet. Quantum coherence is extraordinarily fragile. It survives in laboratory conditions at temperatures near absolute zero, carefully isolated from environmental norms. A living neuron operates at 37 degrees Celsius, surrounded by a constant thermal storm of molecular activity. Quantum states in that environment would decohere, collapse into classical behavior in femtoseconds. Far too fast to do any useful computation, far too fast to produce anything meaningful. The physicist Max Tegmark ran the numbers in 2000 and published a paper calculating that decoherence in neural microtubules would occur roughly 10 million times faster than the timescales relevant to neural processing. The paper was widely cited. Many physicists considered the case closed. Here is where the story gets complicated. Around the same time that Tegmark's paper was circulating, biologists were finding quantum coherence in places where the same logic said it should be impossible. Photosynthesis is a warm, wet, noisy biochemical process. Quantum effects should be drowned out immediately. In 2007, researchers at Berkeley published evidence of quantum coherence in the photosynthetic complexes of green sulfur bacteria, specifically in the way energy is transferred from light-harvesting molecules to the reaction center. The transfer was too efficient. Classical random walk diffusion cannot account for it. The energy appears to sample multiple pathways simultaneously, quantum mechanically, and find the optimal route in a warm, wet biological system. Coherence timescales that should have been femtoseconds were lasting hundreds of femtoseconds, long enough to matter for the process. Then bird navigation. European robins use the Earth's magnetic field for orientation during migration. The mechanism appears to involve cryptochrome proteins in the eye, where light triggers a radical pair reaction, and the quantum spin states of that pair remain entangled long enough to be sensitive to magnetic field direction. Quantum entanglement. In a living bird's eye, at body temperature. This is not disputed. The effect has been reproduced, and the quantum basis of it is the current working explanation in the field. These are not isolated anomalies, they are patterns. Biology keeps finding ways to exploit quantum effects in exactly the environments where physics said quantum effects would not survive. The structural features of biological systems, the specific geometry of proteins, the shielding properties of certain molecular arrangements, appear to be doing something that random thermal noise should prevent. Whether evolution selected for these features deliberately is a separate question. That the features exist is not. Penrose and Hameroff updated Orch-OR to incorporate these findings. The warm-wet objection was never as clean as Tegmark's paper made it sound, because Tegmark modelled microtubules as free-floating in the cytoplasm, exposed to maximum thermal noise, without accounting for the shielding geometries Hameroff had identified. That model is contested. The actual thermal environment inside a microtubule lattice is not the same as the bulk cellular environment. Whether the difference is large enough to allow biologically relevant quantum coherence is an open empirical question. It is not a settled one. The argument that quantum biology is impossible in warm-wet systems looked like a closed case until nature started producing counterexamples in every warm-wet system researchers thought to look at. Stuart Hameroff is an anesthesiologist, which is not the background you would expect for someone proposing a theory of quantum consciousness, until you understand what anesthesia actually does at the molecular level. Most people think of anesthesia as something that simply shuts the brain down. You go under, you stop being there, you come back. The clinical description is clean. The molecular story is not. Anesthetic gases do not work by flooding the brain with a sedative. They do not block neurotransmitters the way painkillers do. They bind to specific sites on tubulin proteins, the proteins that make up microtubules. And when they bind there, they disrupt something very specific. They interfere with quantum van der Waals interactions at those sites. Van der Waals forces are weak, short-range quantum interactions between electron clouds. They operate at the scale where quantum mechanics governs the behavior, not classical chemistry. And when anesthetic gases bind to those tubulin sites, they interrue, PT those interactions, then consciousness stops. Here is the thing about that sequence. It is not accidental that it happens in that order. The Orch-OR model made a prediction. If consciousness arises from quantum computations in microtubules, then any agent that disrupts quantum coherence in microtubules should suppress consciousness. That is a testable, specific, falsifiable claim. It names a mechanism, identifies a location, and tells you what should happen if you interfere with that location. This is what a predictive model looks like. This is the scientific method working the way it is supposed to work. Hameroff brought the clinical expertise. He knew what anesthetics did behaviorally, but more than that, he knew what different anesthetic agents had in common structurally. The agents that produce unconsciousness, gases like halothane, isoflurane, xenon, bind to hydrophobic pockets within tubulin proteins. Agents that do not reach those sites do not produce unconsciousness, even when they produce other effects on the nervous system. That specificity matters. It is not that any molecule that gets into the brain switches the lights off. It is this class of molecules binding here, disrupting this type of interaction. The correlation is tight. Now, look at what classical neuroscience offers as an explanation for the same phenomenon. The standard model treats consciousness as something the brain produces through synaptic activity, neural firing patterns, and information processing distributed across networks. Anesthetics under this framework should suppress consciousness by disrupting synaptic transmission and reducing network activity in the right regions. That is broadly true. Anesthetics do suppress synaptic transmission. They do reduce activity in specific brain regions. But here is the problem. That same disruption occurs with many agents that do not produce unconsciousness. And the classical model cannot tell you precisely why the specific binding of anesthetic gases to tubulin hydrophobic pockets correlates so reliably with the loss of consciousness specifically, as opposed to other cognitive effects. The mechanism for unconsciousness under the classical model is not pinned down. It is inferred from the behavioral outcome and mapped backward onto a network theory that cannot generate a clean prediction. The quantum model runs in the opposite direction. It starts from molecular specificity and predicts the behavioral outcome. That is a structurally different kind of explanation, and the laboratory results have not contradicted it. Studies on tubulin binding confirm that anesthetic gases occupy those hydrophobic sites at concentrations consistent with clinical anesthesia. Research on quantum coherence in biological systems has shown that quantum effects in warm, wet protein environments are not automatically destroyed by thermal noise the way the early objections claimed. The experiments point in the direction the model predicted. None of this is classified. None of it is buried. It is published, it is accessible, and it has been available to the field for years. Why is it not in the textbooks? Here is my position on that. The anesthesia mechanism is one of the most concrete pieces of evidence the Orch-OR model has produced. It is concrete because it is specific. It is specific because it names a site, a type of interaction, and a measurable consequence. That is a higher standard of evidence than most hypotheses in consciousness research are ever held to, because most hypotheses in consciousness research never generate a testable molecular prediction in the first place. The classical model of consciousness has not explained the anesthesia mechanism. It has described the behavioral correlation. There is a difference, and it is a large one. When anesthetic gases bind to tubulin, at those hydrophobic pockets, something happens that classical synaptic theory does not fully account for. You do not experience. The model that connects that molecular event to that experiential outcome is the quantum model. The evidence has moved in its direction. The field has noted this carefully and continued as before. A theory that makes a specific prediction, points you to a specific mechanism, and then produces experimental results. Consistent with that, prediction has earned more serious attention than a model that cannot tell you why switching off the lights produces darkness. Before you can understand why quantum consciousness is either a serious scientific proposal or the most disturbing idea in modern physics, depending on where you stand, you need to understand one thing about quantum mechanics that the textbooks do not foreground. Not the wave-particle duality explanation. Not Schrödinger's cat, which gets used as a shorthand so often it has lost most of its actual meaning. The thing the textbooks do not foreground is the measurement problem. And once you see it clearly, the connection to everything we have been building here becomes unavoidable. Here is what the measurement problem actually is. A quantum system, an electron, a photon, any particle operating at the quantum scale does not have a single definite state before it is measured. It exists in superposition. Multiple possible states, all simultaneously real according to the mathematics, all described by the wave function. Not that we do not know which state it is in. Not that it is in one state and we have not checked yet. The particle genuinely does not have a definite value for the property until measurement forces resolution. The mathematics is not ambiguous about this. 30 years of experimental confirmation back it up. Quantum systems exist in superposition of real simultaneous states, and measurement resolves that superposition into one outcome. Now here is the question that the textbook moves past too quickly. What is measurement? What counts? This is not a side issue. This is the center of the problem. Because the mathematics of quantum mechanics tells you precisely how a superposition evolves.
Open your mind to
over
a journey
time.
of a lifetime, a journey
part
that
is solved.
happens within a fraction
It is
of a
the
second.
Schrödinger equation.
Welcome
It
to
is
the
exact
electrifying world
and
of brain
predictive to
neurons where
extraordinary
impulses
precision.
are unleashed. Imagine, if you will, a
mathematics does not
bustling
tell
city at
is
peak
when the
hour.
superposition
Now replace
stops.
that city with your brain and the
What causes
vehicles with
collapse?
neurons. Each neuron, a marvel of nature carrying
measurement
important
event.
messages at lightning
Two
speed.
interpretations
There's no
have
room for
dominated
error
the
in this
debate
high-stakes
for nearly
relay
a
race.
century.
A single
Neither
misstep
one resolves
could
this
result in a
cleanly.
miscommunication,
That is the
potentially
part
leading to
worth
dire
sitting with.
consequences.
The
But
Copenhagen
fear not,
interpretation
these
is the
diligent
standard
little
version
messengers
taught in
hardly
physics
ever
courses
falter.
worldwide.
The journey of a
It
brain
says
impulse
the
is not
wave
just speedy,
function collapses
it's
upon
intricate.
measurement, and
Neurons
the
don't
probability of
just
each
pass the
outcome
message
is given
along,
by the
they
Born
transform
rule.
it,
This is
modulate it, and even
operationally
amplify
correct.
it. From the
It
moment you
produces the
decide
right
to lift your
numbers
finger
every
to the
time.
actual act,
The problem is
countless
what it leaves
neurons
deliberately
spring into
undefined.
action, working
What counts
together
as a
in
measurement?
perfect harmony.
Copenhagen
So
does
next
not
time you
say.
blink or breathe,
The
remember
founding
there's a
figures,
whole
Bohr,
world of activity
Heisenberg,
happening right
were
inside your head.
explicit that quantum
Unseen,
mechanics
unheard,
describes
but
the results of
undeniably
observations,
present.
and
This
that
is the
asking what
electrifying
happening
journey of
between
brain
observations
neurons,
is not
where
a
every
meaningful
second
question
impulses
within
are
the field.
unleashed.
That is not a solution to the measurement problem. That is a decision to stop asking it. And that decision is baked into the most widely taught version of quantum mechanics in the world. The many worlds interpretation, developed by Hugh Everett in 1957, takes a different approach. No collapse. The Schrödinger equation applies universally, always, without exception. When a quantum system in superposition interacts with a measuring device, the device also enters superposition. When you look at the device, you also enter superposition. The universe branches. Every possible outcome occurs in a separate branch of reality, and every branch is equally real. There is no collapse, because there is nothing that collapses. There is only the wave function, expanding and branching without end. Many worlds solves the collapse problem by eliminating collapse. It is mathematically clean. Physicists who find Copenhagen's undefined observer intolerable tend to find many worlds attractive for exactly this reason. Here is the thing, though. Many worlds does not actually resolve the measurement problem either. It relocates it. The question was, why do we observe a single definite outcome? Many worlds answers, you only think you observe a single outcome. Your branch of the wave function contains one result. Other branches contain the others. But then the question becomes why you experience a single branch at all, why the branching feels like a single definite world from the inside. And that is not answered by the mathematics. That is the same gap in a different location. What both interpretations share is this. The classical world we experience, definite, single-valued, locally consistent, does not follow automatically from the quantum mechanics that describes reality at the foundational level. Something additional is required. Copenhagen calls it measurement and refuses to define it. Many worlds calls it branching and cannot explain why one branch feels real from the inside. Decoherence, the process by which quantum systems lose coherence through interaction with their environment, explains why superpositions become practically invisible at large scales. It does not explain why a single outcome is experienced. These are different problems. Now bring consciousness back in. The Copenhagen interpretation requires, at minimum, something that registers outcomes. That is what measurement is. Something interacts with the quantum system, and the superposition resolves. The chain of physical interactions, particle to detector to recording device to display, is itself a quantum system, and within the Schrödinger equation, it should all remain in superposition. Something terminates the chain. Copenhagen says that something is measurement. What counts as measurement? The founders said, an observer. What is an observer? Here the physics goes quiet. John von Neumann formalized this in 1932. He showed mathematically that the chain of physical interactions during a measurement has no natural termination point within quantum mechanics. Every physical system involved in a measurement can itself be treated quantum mechanically and added to the superposition. The only thing that terminates the chain, in von Neumann's formalism, is a conscious observer, not a detector, not a recording device, something that actually registers an outcome as an outcome. He was not making a philosophical suggestion. He was showing where the mathematics runs out of physical things to invoke. This is not a fringe interpretation from the early days before we knew better. The measurement problem remains open. Every serious treatment of quantum foundations acknowledges that. The experiments that have been done since von Neumann, Bell inequality violations, quantum erasure, delayed choice results, have made it harder to dismiss. The theory works, predictions are exact. The mechanism behind those predictions is not understood. The most successful predictive theory in scientific history contains at its center a gap it has never filled, and the name of the gap is what counts as an observer and why. The double-slit experiment is usually taught as a demonstration of wave-particle duality, which is true, and also misses the part that should stop you cold. Here is what actually happens. You fire electrons one at a time through two narrow slits toward a detection screen. No stream of particles, single electrons, sent through one at a time. What builds up on the screen is an interference pattern. Bands of high and low probability, the signature of a wave. The electron by itself somehow passes through both slits simultaneously and interferes with itself. That is strange enough. But here is where it crosses into something else entirely. When you place a detector at the slits to record which slit the electron actually goes through, the interference pattern disappears. You get two bands, exactly what you would expect from particles. The act of measuring which path the electron took destroys the wave behavior. The detector does not push the electron. It does not physically disturb it in any meaningful mechanical sense. It observes it, and the observation changes what physically happens. Most physics courses stop there. Wave-particle duality, measurement affects the system next chapter. What they do not linger on is the obvious question sitting right in the middle of that result. What is it about measurement that does this? What counts as a measurement? A camera? A photon detector? A human eye? The physics gives you the formula. It does not tell you where the boundary is. John Wheeler pushed this further than almost anyone was comfortable with. His delayed choice experiment is the version that should be kept from people who need to sleep. The setup modifies the double-slit arrangement so that the decision about whether to measure which path the particle took is made after the particle has already passed through the slits. The particle has already gone through. The interference or non-interference pattern has, in some sense, already begun to form. Then you decide whether to look. And what you find on the screen changes based on that decision. Retroactively. The particle's behavior at the slits appears to depend on a measurement choice made after the fact. This has been tested. It is not a thought experiment anymore. The results are consistent with Wheeler's prediction. The decision to observe, made after the quantum event, determines what the quantum event was. Here is the thing. That result has no comfortable interpretation. None. Either information travels backward in time, which breaks causality, or the particle had no definite history until the measurement was made, which breaks classical realism, or the universe branches at every quantum event, which is many worlds, and carries its own set of implications nobody wants to sit with. Pick your discomfort. Every option on the table is disturbing. Now look at the EPR paradox. Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen published it in 1935 as an argument that quantum mechanics had to be incomplete. Take two particles that interact and become entangled. Separate them across any distance. Measure a property of one. The other particle instantly takes on the corresponding correlated state, regardless of how far apart they are. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance and considered it proof that quantum mechanics was missing something. Hidden variables, local properties the particles carried from the start. What the Bell inequality tests confirmed, decades later, is that Einstein was wrong. The correlations are too strong to be explained by any local hidden variable theory. The particles do not carry pre-existing definite values. The measurement of one genuinely affects the other faster than light could connect them across arbitrary distance. The classical picture of a universe built from locally separate objects with independently real properties is not an approximation. It is wrong. This is the background against which you have to place the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation. John von Neumann, one of the most rigorous mathematical minds in the history of physics, worked through the measurement problem in formal detail in the 1930s. His conclusion was this: the chain of quantum measurement, particle interacts with detector, detector state becomes correlated with particle state, detector interacts with the observer, does not terminate within physical systems. Each physical system you add to the chain is itself quantum mechanical. Each one can be described in superposition. The chain does not collapse to a definite outcome unless something outside the chain of physical systems registers it. Von Neumann concluded that the chain terminates in consciousness. Eugene Wigner formalized this further. Wigner's friend is the thought experiment that makes the structure explicit. One observer inside a lab measures a quantum system. From outside the lab, the entire system, observer included, remains in superposition until a second observer makes a measurement. Consciousness in this framework is not just correlated with the physical outcome, it is what produces it. Most physicists today reject this. Here is my position on that rejection. They reject it without having a satisfying replacement. The many worlds interpretation avoids the need for consciousness by saying the wave function never collapses, every branch is equally real. And what we call observation is just entanglement between the observer and one branch. That resolves the collapse problem, but does not explain why any branch is experienced rather than none. Decoherence theory explains why quantum superpositions become effectively classical for large systems interacting with environments. That is useful and correct as far as it goes. It does not explain why any of this produces experience. The Copenhagen interpretation says the wave function collapse is caused by measurement and declines to SA, what counts as a measurement in any rigorous sense. That is not a resolution. That is the problem restated as a policy of not answering it. The discomfort with von Neumann-Wigner is not that it has been refuted. It is that it requires consciousness to be something the physics needs, not something the physics produces. That is a different category of claim. If consciousness is upstream of physical outcomes, then the standard picture, a matter exists, interacts, generates brains, brains generate consciousness, does not just need refinement. It has the sequence backward. And every implication downstream of that reversal is something the field is not structured to follow. What does it mean that an observation collapses a wave function if the observer is just neurons firing? Neurons are quantum systems. Their states should be in superposition like everything else. You cannot use a quantum system to terminate a quantum chain any more than you can use a ruler to measure itself. The boundary has to be somewhere else. Von Neumann put it at consciousness. The mainstream has spent 90 years declining to say where else it goes. If consciousness is required to close the measurement chain, then the universe as a physical system is not complete without it. And that is not a philosophical position. That is what the math requires, if you follow it without deciding in advance where you are allowed to stop. There is a logical move available in the consciousness debate that solves the hard problem cleanly, has serious philosophical and scientific backing, and is treated by most mainstream researchers with a specific kind of careful non-engagement reserved for ideas that go somewhere nobody wants to follow. The move is panpsychism. The claim is simple. Consciousness is not produced by matter reaching a certain level of complexity. Consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality. It is there at the bottom, not assembled from parts that lack it. The hard problem disappears the moment you accept this, because there is no longer a gap between non-conscious matter and conscious experience. The experience was always part of what matter is. Here is the thing about that framing. It sounds like mysticism until you trace who has actually endorsed it. Philip Goff, a philosopher at Durham, whose academic credentials are not in question, has made the case publicly and in peer-reviewed form. David Chalmers, the same philosopher who formally defined the hard problem, has taken panpsychism seriously as the most coherent available response to it. Freeman Dyson, one of the most decorated theoretical physicists of the 20th century, wrote that mind is in some sense present in every electron. These are not marginal figures operating outside the conversation. They are the people who defined what the conversation is about, and their position is that consciousness goes all the way down. Why does this not get more institutional traction? Ask the question, and the answer is not hard to find. If consciousness is fundamental, then it predates the brain. It predates biology. It predates the solar system. The entire framework that positions neuroscience as the science of consciousness collapses into a much stranger question. You are no longer asking how the brain generates experience. You are asking why this particular arrangement of always conscious matter produces this particular kind of experience. That is a different field with different methods, and no existing institution is built to run it. Now, panpsychism has a genuine internal problem. Grant the premise entirely. Grant that every fundamental particle carries some proto-conscious property, some minimal form of experience. You still have to explain how those minimal properties combine into the unified, structured, first-person experience you are having right now. That is called the combination problem, and it is not solved. How does the proto-experience of 1 trillion subatomic particles become the single experience of reading these words? Nobody has a complete answer. Here is my position on that. The combination problem is hard. It is genuinely hard, but it is a different category of problem than what the classical materialist faces. The materialist has to explain how 0 units of experience
Open your mind to a
sum
journey of a
1 unit
lifetime, a journey that
experience.
happens within a fraction of a
Panpsychism has to
second.
explain how many
Welcome
small
to the
units
electrifying world
combine
of
into
brain
one
neurons
large
where
and unified
impulses are
unit.
unleashed.
Both are
Imagine, if you will, a
But one of
bustling
them
city at peak
requires
hour.
something from nothing.
Now replace that
The
city
other
with
just
your brain and the
requires an
vehicles with
explanation of
neurons.
structure.
Each neuron, a
Those are not
marvel of
equivalent
nature, carrying
differences.
important
One
messages
gap
at lightning
is in
speed.
principle bridgeable.
There's no room for
The other
error
one
in this
has
high-stakes
never had
relay
even the
race. A
beginning
single
of a
misstep could
And that
result
is
in a
exactly
miscommunication,
where dual
potentially
autonomics
leading to
work
dire
better.
consequences. But
Tononi
fear
is
not,
a neuroscientist
these
at
diligent
the
little
University of
messengers
Wisconsin.
hardly ever
In
falter.
the early 2000s,
The journey
he
of a
developed
brain
what
impulse
now
is not
called
just speedy,
Integrated
it's
Information
intricate.
Theory, or
Neurons don't just
IIT.
pass the message along,
It is
they
not a
transform it,
philosophical
modulate
position.
it, and even
It is a
amplify it.
formal
From the moment you
mathematical
decide to
framework.
lift your finger to the actual
IIT
act, countless
starts from
neurons
first
spring into
principles
action,
about what
working together
consciousness
in
requires
perfect
and
harmony.
derives a
So
quantity
next time you
Tononi
blink or
calls
breathe, remember
phi,
there's a whole
a
world
measure
of
how
activity
much
happening right
integrated
inside your
information
head.
a system contains
Unseen,
above and
unheard,
beyond
but
the information
undeniably
contained in its
present.
parts.
This is the electrifying
Systems with
journey
high
of brain
phi
neurons,
have high
where
consciousness.
every second impulses
Systems with
are
low phi
unleashed.
have low consciousness. Systems with 0 phi have none. The framework is not vague. Phi is calculable. For simple systems, it has been calculated. For the human brain, full calculation is computationally intractable at present, but the architecture is in place. This is a mathematically precise claim about what consciousness is, where it exists, and in what quantity. That is not what philosophy usually produces. That is what physics produces. And the conclusion IIT produces is deeply uncomfortable. Under IIT, consciousness is not a special property of neurons. It is a property of information integration. Any system that integrates information in the right way, above a certain threshold, has experience. That includes some animals, probably. It may include some simple organisms. It potentially includes systems we have never considered conscious. The theory does not arbitrarily stop at a boundary that makes us comfortable. It goes where the mathematics goes. What happened to IIT in the mainstream? The engagement pattern is familiar at this point. Researchers took it seriously enough to write papers engaging with its formalism. Christoph Koch, the neuroscientist at the Allen Institute, worked alongside Tononi for years and publicly endorsed IIT as the most rigorous approach to consciousness available. The theory was discussed in leading journals. And then the conversation reached the threshold where the conclusions became unavoidable and the engagement became notably more careful. Not hostile, careful. The kind of careful that does not follow the question to where it leads. Because if IIT is right, the question of what has experience is not a binary question with humans or brains on one side and everything else on the other. It is a continuous spectrum. And that spectrum does not have a natural cutoff that stops before it reaches. Places the institutional framework is not equipped to handle. You cannot endorse the formalism while refusing the result. But that is almost exactly what the reception of IIT looks like from the outside. Engaged with the math, quiet about the conclusion. IIT has a mathematical formalism, a set of testable predictions, and a conclusion that consciousness is a property of information integration itself, potentially universal. That the researchers who find the formalism most compelling have been notably reluctant to say in public. In 1964, a physicist named John Bell published a theorem that most people have never heard of, and that settles, mathematically, one of the most disturbing questions about the nature of reality. The question is this: are quantum particles separate objects that simply have properties we haven't measured yet, or is something stranger happening? Einstein believed the first option. He called the alternative spooky action at a distance, and spent the last decades of his life arguing it was impossible. Bell's theorem gave experimenters a way to test it, not philosophically, mathematically. If particles are locally separate objects with hidden predetermined properties, their measurement results must satisfy certain statistical limits. Those limits are called Bell inequalities. By the 1980s, physicist Alain Aspect and his team had run the experiments with enough precision to give a clear answer. The inequalities were violated. Repeatedly, decisively. The experiments have been refined and repeated and tightened against every possible loophole for 40 years since. The result has not changed. Local hidden variables cannot explain what quantum systems actually do. Here is what that means. It does not mean particles communicate faster than light. It means something more unsettling. It means the classical picture of the universe from separately existing objects, each with its own definite importance, is wrong at the level of the actual physics. Two particles that have interacted are not two separate things in the way the classical worldview assumes. They are described by a single quantum state. Measuring one of them instantaneously determines what you will find when you measure the other, regardless of the distance between them. Not because a signal passed between them, because the separation itself is not fundamental. The universe at its base level is not a collection of isolated objects. It is something non-locally connected that produces the appearance of separate objects under certain conditions. Most physicists accept the experimental results and then stop there. They treat non-locality as an interesting feature of quantum formalism and move on. Here is the problem with stopping there. If the universe is non-locally connected at the level where its actual mechanics operate, that is a fact about the nature of reality. Not a curiosity about particles in a laboratory. The separateness that everyday experience presents as obvious, you here, everything else out there, is a derived property of some deeper structure, not a fundamental one. Classical intuitions about objects fail, not just at the scale of particles, but as a description of what the universe actually is. Now, bring the consciousness question back in. Several sections back, we established that the Copenhagen interpretation requires something that registers quantum outcomes, and that what that something is remains undefined. Now we know that the states being registered are non-locally connected across arbitrary distances. If conscious observation plays a role in collapsing entangled states, and the von Neumann chain analysis gives you no clean way to stop that argument short of consciousness, then whatever is doing that collapsing is participating in a non-local physical structure. Consciousness would not be sitting inside a brain observing an external universe made of separate things. It would be embedded in and interacting with something that is not fundamentally separate at all. That is a different picture of what a mind is and where it sits relative to everything else. Here is the dark part. Nobody has a fully satisfying answer for what the non-local structure is. Many worlds avoids the collapse problem by saying everything branches and nothing collapses. But then every quantum event produces a branching of reality, which means reality is not one thing, and the question of who is experiencing which branch and what that means for identity and continuity is not a solved problem. It is a shelved problem, with a sophisticated name attached to it. This is where the simulation argument enters, not as science fiction, as a formal philosophical framework. Nick Bostrom published a rigorous version in 2003. The core logic: if civilizations can reach computational maturity, and if they run detailed simulations of prior civilizations, the number of simulated minds vastly outnumbers the number of biological ones, which means any given mind is statistically more likely to be simulated than biological. This is taken seriously by serious people. What almost nobody discusses is how cleanly it maps onto the quantum measurement problem. A simulated universe would not need to compute states that are not being observed. It would only need to resolve definite outcomes when something with the right properties interacted with it. That is precisely what quantum mechanics describes. The universe behaves exactly as you would expect. A computation to behave that renders outcomes on demand and leaves everything else in superposition until needed. The connection between the simulation hypothesis and quantum consciousness is not a loose analogy. The measurement problem is what you would get if both were pointing at the same underlying fact from different angles. Yet the two literatures do not cite each other seriously. The boundary between them gets treated as more solid than the evidence justifies. What Bell's theorem took off the table permanently is the comfortable classical version of reality, a universe of separately existing things with definite local properties that simply interact according to fixed rules. That version is experimentally ruled out. What replaces it? What the non-local structure actually is, what counts as the observer that resolves it, whether consciousness is a feature of that structure or a product of it. Those questions are open. They have been open for 60 years. The universe at the level where its actual mechanics operate is not made of separate things that influence each other. It is made of something that becomes separate things when something with the right properties interacts with it. And what has the right properties, and why, is the question, though, that keeps not getting answered. 30 years after Penrose published the argument, and Hameroff identified the physical substrate, the status of quantum consciousness research inside mainstream neuroscience and physics looks almost identical to the status of the Silurian hypothesis inside mainstream geology. Here is the pattern. A formally published argument, credentialed authors, peer-reviewed journal, logic that holds under scrutiny. Initial coverage, a round of objections at the level of the easy targets, and then, functionally, silence. Not refutation. Silence. No funded research programs, no coordinated experimental effort to test the core claims. Citations in footnotes, careful acknowledgements that the question exists, and a field that continues operating as though the question does not require an answer. Penrose and Hameroff have been publishing versions of Orch-OR since the early 1990s, 30-plus years of papers, responses to objections, updated models, incorporating new findings from quantum biology. The warm, wet objection came in, and they answered it. The decoherence timescale objection came in, and they addressed it. The photosynthesis data arrived and supported them. The anesthesia binding data arrived and supported them. A normal scientific process, where a hypothesis survives repeated contact with new evidence, would generate increasing research investment. More labs, more funding, more graduate students pointed at the question. That is not what happened. What happened is that the objections got answered and the field moved on anyway. Compare that to what happens with a consciousness paper that stays inside the classical framework. A paper proposing a new model of global workspace theory, or predictive coding, or some variation on the neural correlates of consciousness gets covered, cited, built upon, funded for follow-up work. The machinery of normal science engages. That machinery exists. It just does not engage with the quantum direction at the same rate. And the difference in engagement does not track the difference in evidence quality. It tracks something else. Here is what it tracks. Career exposure. The professional cost of pursuing quantum consciousness seriously is asymmetric in exactly the way it is asymmetric in every other case where this pattern appears. Commit to this research direction and get it wrong, and the damage to your credibility is permanent. You are the physicist who thought consciousness was quantum. You are the neuroscientist who studied microtubules and consciousness and ended up in the science journalism section that runs next to astrology. Stay inside the classical framework, produce incremental work, and nothing bad happens to you professionally, regardless of whether the classical framework ever solves the hard problem. The incentive structure does not reward the person who follows the uncomfortable question. It punishes them. Now look at the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. A team of researchers published evidence in 2007 that a large-scale cosmic impact event triggered the Younger Dryas cooling period roughly 12,900 years ago. Formally published. Evidence from multiple continents. Platinum group element spikes, nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, a thin black matte layer in the sediment record at the same date worldwide. The response from mainstream geology was to note it carefully, run some critical papers on methodology, and not build a funded research program around it. The evidence has accumulated over 15 years. The gap in the explanation is still open. The same pattern. The Sphinx. Geologist Robert Schoch published peer-reviewed work in the early 1990s arguing that the weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure indicate water erosion from a period of heavy rainfall that predates the conventional construction date by thousands of years. His credentials were solid. The geological argument was specific and testable. The response from Egyptology was not to run a funded program examining the hypothesis. It was to note that the implications were too large and move on. Here is the question. In all four cases, the Silurian hypothesis, the PETM carbon gap, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, quantum consciousness, is the absence of follow-up research because the evidence is weak? Or is it because the evidence is strong and points toward a conclusion the field is not structured to absorb? Because weak evidence gets refuted. When a hypothesis fails on the data, the process is straightforward. You publish the refutation, the hypothesis loses traction, researchers stop spending time on it. That is not what happened here. What happened is that the evidence survived initial contact with objections, and the field responded by quietly redirecting its attention. That is a different thing. That is not refutation. That is avoidance. And avoidance tells you something. It tells you the question is alive. A dead question does not need to be avoided. You only avoid a question when following it would require you to arrive somewhere you are not prepared to go. When the same institutional pattern repeats across geology, archaeology, physics, and neuroscience, careful acknowledgement, no follow-up, an open gap that nobody funds the research to close. The explanation that works for all four cases simultaneously is not that all four bodies of evidence are weak. Here is what follows if the quantum consciousness researchers are right. Not the comfortable version where it just means consciousness is interesting and mysterious, but the version where you follow the logic to where it actually goes. Start with the first implication. If observation participates in collapsing physical reality, if the measurement problem is solved by consciousness rather than by some mechanical process inside the apparatus,
Open your mind to a
then
journey
there
of a
is no
lifetime,
clean
a
line
journey that
between the
happens
observer
within a
and the
fraction
thing
of a
being
second.
observed. None.
Welcome to the electrifying
classical
world of
picture
brain
assumes a
neurons
universe
where
that exists
impulses
out
are
there,
unleashed.
fully formed,
Imagine, if you will, a
independent of
bustling
any
city at
experience
peak
of
hour.
it.
Now replace that
Objects
city with your
with
brain
definite
and the
positions,
vehicles with neurons.
particles
Each
with
neuron,
definite
a
states,
marvel of nature,
a reality
carrying
that runs
important
whether or
messages
not
at lightning
anything is
speed.
looking.
There's no room for
That
error in this
picture is not
high-stakes
just
relay race. A
philosophically
single
questionable
misstep
under
could result in a
quantum consciousness
miscommunication,
frameworks.
potentially leading
It
to
is
dire
specifically
consequences.
contradicted by the
But
physics.
fear not, these diligent
wave
little
function does
messengers
not
hardly
collapse
ever falter.
until something
The
registers
journey
it.
of a brain impulse is
Before
not
that
just speedy,
registration,
it's
the
intricate.
system is not in a
Neurons
definite
don't just
state.
pass the
T.
message along, they
It is in a
transform it,
superposition
modulate
of
it, and even
states,
amplify it.
all
From
of
the
them,
moment you decide to lift your finger
simultaneously.
to the actual act,
What that
countless
means is that
neurons
the
spring
universe
into
of
action,
definite
working
objects
together in
you think you are
perfect
living
harmony.
inside
So next
is
time you
not the
blink or
base
breathe,
layer
remember
of
there's a
reality.
whole world of
It is
activity
what
happening
reality
right
looks
inside
like
your
after
head.
consciousness has
Unseen,
interacted with
unheard,
it.
but
The objective world
undeniably
is not
present.
prior to experience.
This is the
It is
electrifying journey
downstream
of
of
brain
it.
neurons,
Here is the thing about
where
that.
every second
Most
impulses
people
are
hear it
unleashed.
and treat it as an abstraction, something that applies at the quantum scale and dissolves before it reaches the level of chairs and planets. But that response assumes decoherence fully closes the gap, that the quantum weirdness gets washed out before it reaches macroscopic experience. And that assumption has not been demonstrated. Decoherence explains why quantum superpositions become difficult to detect at large scales. It does not explain why a definite outcome occurs at all. The measurement problem is still open. The gap is still there. And the gap is not at the bottom of reality, safely contained. It is at the boundary between any physical system and any registering of that system, which is everywhere, all the time. Now move to the second implication. If consciousness is fundamental, not produced by complexity, not a late arrival in a universe that ran for 9 billion years without it, then it did not begin with neurons. It did not begin with brains. It did not begin with multicellular life. The universe has had this property from the start, not human consciousness, not anything like your experience of reading these words, but proto-conscious properties, the raw capacity for something like experience, woven into the structure of reality at the foundational level. That is what integrated information theory requires. That is what the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation requires. That is what panpsychism concludes. The cutoff we drew, the line between things that experience and things that do not, was never justified by the physics. We drew it because it felt right, because rocks do not act like they feel anything. But the absence of behavior is not the same as the absence of experience. We infer other human minds from behavior too. The inference was always an assumption. Here is the dark part. If IT is correct, and consciousness scales with integrated information, then the question of what has experience becomes continuous, not binary. Not, does this system experience or not, but how much? And the systems with non-trivial integration include things we have never considered candidates. The nervous system of a worm, a simple neural network, potentially any system complex enough to integrate information across its components. The boundary, we assumed, was drawn at neurons, at brains, at organisms with sufficient behavioral complexity. The physics did not draw that boundary. We did. And the physics does not support it. Now here is the implication most people stop before reaching. The many worlds interpretation. Take it seriously for one moment. Every quantum event, Every moment where a system exists in superposition and a measurement occurs does not produce one outcome. It produces all of them. Reality branches. Both outcomes happen. In separate branches, both are equally real. There is no preferred branch. No branch where the universe actually landed. Just an ever-expanding structure of every quantum event that has ever occurred, playing out every possible resolution simultaneously. That is what the math describes when you do not add a collapse mechanism. And if consciousness is what registers these outcomes, if experience is the thing that makes a branch real in the relevant sense, then something is experiencing every branch. Not a ghost, not a copy, something with the same relationship to consciousness that you have right now. The universe is not running one experiment. It is running every experiment that quantum mechanics permits, all at once, always. What does that mean for identity? What does it mean for death? Here is where the logic goes, somewhere most people do not follow it. If every quantum branch is equally real, and if consciousness threads through those branches rather than terminate them, then the picture of a self that exists on one timeline from birth to death is not what physics describes. It is a narrative imposed on a structure that does not have that shape. The branch where you are reading this is one of an incomprehensible number of branches where versions of you are doing other things, having other outcomes, reaching other ends. None of those branches is more real than another. The question of what happens at death becomes a question about what happens to the branching structure of experience at the point where the biological system that has been registering quantum states stops integrating information. And that question has not been answered. Not by the classical model, which does not take the question seriously, not by the quantum model, which takes it seriously and reaches conclusions that nobody wants to publish. And what does it mean for shared reality? If the world of definite objects is downstream of experience, and if every conscious system is collapsing its own version of the wave function through its own observations, then the objective shared reality we assume, the one where the table is there whether or not anyone looks at it, the one where your experience and my experience are both windows onto the same external thing, is not guaranteed by the physics. It requires explanation. It requires some account of why different observers converge on consistent outcomes. Decoherence provides a partial answer. Entanglement structures provide a partial answer, but the convergence on a single shared classical world from a quantum substrate that permits every outcome is not fully derived from first principles. It is assumed, and what is assumed cannot be used as evidence against the framework that questions it. Here is my position on all of this. The disturbing part is not the strangeness of these conclusions. Strangeness alone is not evidence of anything. The disturbing part is the source. These conclusions do not come from speculation. They do not come from philosophy departments untethered from data. They come from following quantum mechanics, the theory that predicts the Lamb shift to 10 decimal places, the theory behind every semiconductor and laser and MRI machine, following it without deciding in advance where you are allowed to stop. The mainstream response to quantum consciousness is that these interpretations go too far, that they read too much into the formalism, that the sensible move is to use the predictions without asking what they mean. That is a choice. It is not forced by the evidence. It is forced by what the evidence implies if you take it seriously. And those are different things. The horror is not that the universe might be stranger than we assumed. The horror is that the physics we already have, tested to a precision no other theory in history has achieved, requires us to say something that most physicists will not say out loud, which is that the strangeness is not optional. John Wheeler spent the last decades of his career, after co-developing nuclear weapons theory, after naming the black hole, after training Richard Feynman, arguing for something that most physicists treated as the philosophical ramblings of an old man, which is one way to respond to an idea and not the most intellectually honest one. Here is what Wheeler actually argued. The universe is not a machine running independently in the dark, producing observers as a late byproduct of 13 billion years of chemistry. It is a participatory system. Observers are not passengers, they are components. Without something that registers outcomes, the physical universe does not arrive at definite states. That is not a metaphor. That is a direct reading of the quantum formalism Wheeler spent his career working inside. He called it the participatory universe. He was not speaking loosely. The delayed choice experiment is where this becomes concrete and uncomfortable. The standard version of the double-slit experiment shows that a particle behaves like a wave when unobserved and like a particle when measured. Wheeler took that further. He designed an experiment where the choice of whether to measure is made after the particle has already passed through the apparatus. What the experiment shows, repeatedly, across multiple implementations since, is that the particle's past behavior changes based on a future measurement decision. The measurement does not just reveal what the particle was doing, it retroactively determines what the particle was doing. Read that again. The decision made now reaches backward and fixes the history of a quantum event that already happened. This is in the published literature. This is not contested. The results are real, and they have no satisfying explanation inside any framework that treats time as a sequence of fixed events accumulating behind us. Here is the thing about what that implies. If the act of registering information retroactively determines physical history, then physical history is not a pre-existing record that observers read. It is a record that observers participate in writing. Wheeler's phrase for this was it from bit. Physical reality, mass, energy, space, the entire material world is derived from information. Not the other way around. Matter does not generate information as a byproduct. Information is primary. Matter is what information looks like when something registers it. That is his conjecture. And the reason it cannot be dismissed easily is that it fits the formalism. It is not a poetic restatement of quantum mechanics. It is a claim about what quantum mechanics is actually describing at the level beneath the math. Now here is the question that follows directly. Information requires something to register it. That is not a philosophical position. That is definitional. Information that is never registered, never measured, never interacted with in any way, is not distinguishable from the absence of information. So if physical reality is fundamentally informational, and information requires registration, then physical reality requires something capable of registering it. Observers are not incidental. They are structurally necessary. Wheeler's participatory universe is not a claim that human minds are cosmically special. It is a claim that the category of observer, anything that registers and records a quantum outcome, is built into the architecture of what a physical universe is. Connect this to the anthropic principle, not the weak version, which just notes that the universe's constants are compatible with life because we are here to observe them. The strong participatory version says something different and harder. It says observers are not just lucky recipients of a habitable universe. They are required for the universe to be physically determinate in the relevant sense. The constants, the history, the structure, these are not fixed features of a pre-existing stage that life eventually walks onto. They are outcomes that the existence of observers participates in selecting. That is a different claim. Its implications do not stay inside cosmology. What does it mean for the Fermi paradox? The standard framing asks why, given the age and size of the universe, we have no confirmed evidence of other observers. The usual answers involve extinction rates, communication barriers, the rarity of life. Those are real possibilities, but Wheeler's framework adds something the standard framing omits entirely. If consciousness is required for physical reality to be determinate, then regions of the universe where nothing is observing anything are not just empty. They are, in a precise technical sense, indeterminate, not unvisited, not silent, indeterminate. The scarcity of observers in the universe is not only a sociological puzzle about why nobody called, it is a problem about whether the universe is fully real in the regions where nothing is looking. That is a different problem. It does not have the same solution. Here is my position on how this connects to everything in this discussion. Wheeler was not speculating about consciousness because he was curious about philosophy. He arrived at the participatory universe by following the physics of quantum measurement to its logical end, the same end that von Neumann followed, the same end that the Copenhagen interpretation circles without entering. The physics keeps pointing at the same gap. Something has to register outcomes. Something has to close the measurement chain. What that something is, and what it means that the universe requires it, is the question that the field has spent 70 years carefully stepping around. Wheeler stopped stepping around it. The result was a framework that treats observers not as products of the universe, but as participants in its ongoing physical definition. That is not a comfortable place for the standard model of reality to end up. But comfort is not what the data is optimized for. We did not arrive in a universe that was already fully real and simply discovered it. And the distinction between those two pictures of our situation is not a philosophical nicety. It is the difference between a cosmos and something else entirely. Here is the honest state of what we know and what we do not, without the framing that makes the not knowing comfortable. The hard problem of consciousness has not been solved, not partially solved, not solved in principle pending technical details. The question of why any physical process produces subjective experience at all remains exactly where David Chalmers left it in 1995. Open. The mainstream response has been to reclassify it as either unanswerable or less important than it looks. Neither of those is a solution. Both of them are ways of not having one. The quantum mechanics of observation has not been resolved either. The measurement problem sits at the center of the most precisely tested theory in the history of science. Every interpretation of quantum mechanics that physicists have proposed carries a cost. Copenhagen leaves the observer undefined. Many worlds requires that every quantum event branches reality with no explanation of why we experience only one branch. Consistent histories and relational interpretations each move the problem rather than closing it. The gap has a different name depending on which framework you use. It is still a gap. Here is what has changed over the last 30 years. The experimental evidence for quantum coherence in biological systems has gotten stronger, not weaker. Photosynthesis, bird navigation, enzyme catalysis, warm, wet systems that were supposed to be too noisy for quantum effects to survive.
Open your mind to a journey of a lifetime, a journey that happens within a fraction of a second. Welcome to the electrifying world of brain neurons where impulses are unleashed. Imagine, if you will, a bustling city at peak hour. Now replace that city with your brain and the vehicles with neurons. Each neuron, a marvel of nature, carrying important messages at lightning speed. There's no room for error in this high-stakes relay race. A single misstep could result in a miscommunication, potentially leading to dire consequences. But fear not, these diligent little messengers hardly ever falter. The journey of a brain impulse is not just speedy, it's intricate. Neurons don't just pass the message along, they transform it, modulate it, and even amplify it. From the moment you decide to lift your finger to the actual act, countless neurons spring into action, working together in perfect harmony. So next time you blink or breathe, remember there's a whole world of activity happening right inside your head. Unseen, unheard, but undeniably present. This is the electrifying journey of brain neurons, where every second impulses are unleashed.
But the medium itself cannot give you the answer. The absence of a clear industrial signature is not evidence that no industrial source existed. It is a property of how rock records events across 56 million years. The neuroscience record has exactly the same limitation. Classical neuroscience was built to map correlations between brain states and mental states. It was not built to answer whether consciousness is identical to those brain states or something else running alongside them. The absence of a clear answer from within that framework is not evidence that consciousness is purely physical. It is a property of what the instruments were designed to measure. You cannot rule out something that your methodology was not constructed to detect. Here is my position on that. When people say quantum consciousness has not been proven, they are correct. When they say classical neuroscience has established that consciousness is a product of physical computation, they are not correct. That claim requires the hard problem to already be solved. It is not solved. The claim borrows confidence from a resolution that does not exist. Those two positions are not symmetric. One says, we do not know yet. The other says, we know something we have not actually demonstrated. Panpsychism is not obviously wrong. The participatory universe framework is not obviously wrong. Integrated information theory is not obviously wrong. Each of them is a coherent response to a problem the mainstream has not solved, and each of them has been treated to the same specific pattern. Engagement with the easy objections, careful citation, no funded research programs, no teams formed to test the central hypothesis against the available evidence. 7 years of institutional neglect from those most equipped to examine it becomes 30 years of neglect. The question stays formally open. Nobody closes it. Nobody funds the work that would close it. That is the pattern. It showed up in geology with the PETM. It showed up with the Silurian hypothesis. It is showing up here. The specific form of the non-response is the same each time. Note the finding, cite the paper, move on. Leave the gap in the literature. The explanation that accounts for all of it simultaneously is not that all of the evidence is weak. Some of it is genuinely strong. The question of what consciousness is and what it means for the nature of reality has been formally published, experimentally approached, mathematically modelled, and then left sitting in the literature with an open gap that those most capable of resolving it have spent 30 years carefully not closing. And what you do with that fact is the only thing left that is actually up to you.